kind of knew what the rhythm of the year was. So things like that will change, and how we are part of the support for the monarchy may change slightly without the Queen.
The Westminster Stare. I will never forget the silence that settled inside Westminster Abbey when Laura Camilla's daughter turned her gaze toward Princess Anne. It was not a fleeting glance, not the polite acknowledgement expected in such a setting. It was deliberate, sharp, a glare that seemed to carry the weight of her mother's ambitions and her own defiance. Anne, resolute as ever, met that look without flinching, her expression carved from the same granite resolve that had defined her for decades. In that moment, two worlds collided, one shaped by bloodline and duty, the other by survival and ambition. Camilla sat between them, the mask of composure fixed on her face. To the public, she was still the image of the rehabilitated consort, warm smile, steady presence, the Queen by Charles's side. For years, she had leaned on that mask, perfecting it until it seemed second nature. The BBC had once chronicled how she rebuilt herself through patience and careful appearances, noting her reliance on safe causes and quiet gestures of loyalty. Reuters described her as Charles's indispensable anchor, the partner who steadied him in moments of crisis. But watching Laura's eyes bore into Anne's across the Abbey, I saw the cracks in that mask. It was clear to me then that Camilla's ambitions had extended beyond her own role. Through Laura, she sought to carve a space within the royal fold that bloodlines had never permitted. Laura had lived largely outside the public glare, but now she appeared on stage at one of the monarchy's most symbolic ceremonies, her presence framed not as an invited guest, but as a participant. Anne, whose entire life had been defined by duty, protocol, and sacrifice, understood instantly what was being tested. And her silence in the face of that death stare said everything. The line would not be crossed. The staff near me shifted uncomfortably, their whispers muted, but their eyes wide. They knew, as I did, that this was no ordinary family tension. It was a clash between heritage and ambition, between the traditions embodied by Anne and the encroachment symbolized by Laura. The optics were damning. A death stare inside Westminster was not just a private gesture, it was a public fracture captured by cameras, read by millions as a metaphor for a monarchy at odds with itself. International outlets seized on it within hours. The Guardian wrote of tension simmering beneath the ceremonial calm. Al Jazeera described Laura's glare as an unspoken challenge to the hierarchy of bloodline. Deutsche Welle pointed to Anne's immovable composure as proof that the monarchy still drew its strength from those who had carried its burdens without complaint. Polling data from YouGov, which had long shown generational skepticism toward Camilla, surged with commentary linking the incident back to Diana's legacy and the uneasy acceptance of Camilla's role. For me, the moment at Westminster crystallized something I had long suspected. Camilla's smile was not simply warmth, it was strategy. Her endurance through scandal had hardened into ambition, one that now extended to her children. Laura's glare was the unmasked expression of that ambition, a signal that Camilla's family would not sit quietly at the margins. But ambition within the monarchy, when it collides with bloodline, rarely ends well. Anne's silence carried centuries of weight. It reminded us that titles and roles are not earned through defiance, but through sacrifice, through the quiet duty she herself had lived since childhood. Laura's stare may have burned hot for a moment, but Anne's composure endured immovable as stone. And in that contrast between glare and silence, ambition and tradition, the first cracks in Camilla's carefully constructed role became visible to all. Camilla's maternal ambition. The more I reflected on Westminster, the clearer it became that Laura's glare was not hers alone. It was an extension of Camilla's will. For years, Camilla had carefully rebuilt her own reputation, outlasting scandal and reshaping herself into the indispensable partner at Charles's side. But ambition does not stop at the self. It extends outward, reaching for stability through family seeking validation where history has denied it. Laura, though not born into the royal bloodline, became a vessel for Camilla's maternal ambition. I had seen hints of it before. Subtle introductions at palace receptions, strategic seating at family gatherings, the carefully chosen photographers who ensured Laura appeared near Charles and Camilla at public ceremonies. Each gesture might have been innocuous in isolation, but together, they painted a picture. Camilla was quietly positioning her daughter closer to the heart of the monarchy. The BBC once noted how Camilla's strength lay in soft influence exercised gradually, almost invisibly. But at Westminster, the subtlety cracked. Laura's glare at Anne was not invisible, it was a declaration. Princess Anne, of all people, could not ignore what was being attempted. Her entire life had been defined by service duty and sacrifice, without expectation of favor. She had weathered the press, endured personal trials, and worked tirelessly for the crown without asking for elevation. For her legitimacy within the monarchy was not a gift, it was a burden carried with discipline. To see Camilla's daughter untouched by that tradition, challenge her with nothing more than a stare, was intolerable. It was as if Anne were being asked to recognize ambition as equal to duty, and her silence, her immovable resolve, was her answer. Mainstream reporting reflected this collision. Reuters described it as a clash between bloodline legitimacy and consort ambition. The Guardian went further, suggesting that Camilla was testing the boundaries of inclusion for her family within the royal framework. Deutsche Welle pointed out the symbolism. The monarchy's credibility rests not only on titles, but on the perception of fairness, and any suggestion of favoritism toward non-royal offspring risked corroding that trust. Camilla's defenders argued differently. They insisted she was simply a mother seeking recognition for her children, no different from any other parent. Al Jazeera highlighted this angle, framing it as a human desire for inclusion clashing with rigid institutions. And in truth, I could see why Camilla might want that for Laura, a chance to be accepted, to be seen as more than the daughter of a woman once vilified. Yet monarchy is not a family in the ordinary sense. It is a structure built on continuity, inheritance, and symbolism. Personal desire, no matter how human, cannot easily bend those rules. William's reaction after the Abbey underscored this reality. He did not speak openly, but his distance grew sharper. Catherine, graceful as ever, maintained civility with Camilla, but the warmth between their households cooled further. The children, particularly Charlotte, sensed it too. For them, Diana's memory was not negotiable, and the presence of Camilla's family within their space felt intrusive. I thought often of how Camilla's maternal ambition mirrored her own journey. Just as she had endured decades of scrutiny to claim her place beside Charles, she seemed determined to carve a role for her children even against resistance. Yet history suggested otherwise. No amount of endurance could grant Laura what Anne, William, and Catherine embodied: legitimacy rooted in bloodline trust and sacrifice. The Westminster death stare was therefore more than family tension. It was Camilla's maternal ambition colliding with the monarchy's immovable boundaries. Through Laura, she tested whether endurance could be inherited. Anne's silence gave the answer. The monarchy is not built on inheritance of ambition, but on the weight of blood and the acceptance of duty. In that truth, Camilla's dream for Laura faltered before it could take root. Power optics precedent. In the weeks after Westminster, I found myself replaying the moment in my mind, the sharpness of Laura's glare, the immovable calm in Anne's eyes, and considering what it revealed about power inside the monarchy. Royal life is governed as much by optics as by laws. Every curtsy, every place at a table, every glance exchanged under the glare of cameras carries significance far beyond the moment. It is how the institution projects legitimacy, and it is why Laura's silent challenge to Anne mattered so deeply. Seating charts, for instance, are never casual. They are deliberate hierarchies, carefully arranged to reflect precedence. When Laura was placed within view of Anne at Westminster, the message was subtle, but unmistakable. Camilla was edging her daughter closer to the center of ceremonial life. The optics were dangerous. For the public, such positioning implied elevation, a suggestion that Laura held standing within the monarchy that her birth had never conferred. For Anne, whose life had been shaped by strict adherence to order, the implication was intolerable. Protocol is supposed to prevent such tensions. Yet Camilla's soft power had always been about bending protocol without appearing to break it. She framed her choices as natural, even inevitable. Reuters once described her as adept at reshaping the informal rules of access. But Laura's glare exposed the cost of those maneuvers. In that instant, it was no longer about subtle influence, it was about precedent. If Laura could defy Anne without consequence, What message would that send to the world about how legitimacy is defined? International outlets seized on this nuance. The Guardian wrote of a dangerous test of symbolism, suggesting that monarchy's survival depends on its ability to uphold boundaries that appear fair. Deutsche Welle observed that every gesture becomes precedent, warning that any tolerance of Camilla's maneuver could weaken the institution's credibility. Al Jazeera called it an optics battle with consequences far larger than family tension. Even the BBC, cautious in tone, acknowledged the unease among senior courtiers who feared the erosion of established roles. William and Catherine understood the danger instinctively. They had built their household on transparency and authenticity, projecting an image of family life rooted in service rather than privilege. For them, the idea of Camilla's daughter challenging Anne and by extension the monarchy's bloodline order was not just inappropriate, it was a breach of the trust they sought to uphold. Their silence in the aftermath spoke volumes. They would not dignify the defiance with response, but they would not forget it either. What struck me most was how quickly public interpretation aligned with Anne's resolve. Polls conducted by YouGov after Westminster showed a clear generational split. Younger Britons, already skeptical of Camilla, overwhelmingly saw Laura's presence as illegitimate. Older Britons, while more sympathetic to Camilla's endurance, nonetheless sided with Anne's composure as the mark of true royal duty. The optics had backfired. What was intended as inclusion had been read as intrusion. And this is where precedent matters most. Monarchy is not strengthened by testing boundaries. It is preserved by respecting them. Anne, by holding her silence and refusing to flinch, reinforced the very order Camilla's ambition sought to bend. Her stillness became more powerful than Laura's glare, her composure more enduring than Camilla's maneuvering. In the end, the Abbey moment was a reminder that power in monarchy is not about crowns or jewels alone. It is about optics, the choreography of respect, the adherence to precedent, the trust that legitimacy is not casually reassigned. Through Laura, Camilla tested that order. Through Anne, the monarchy reasserted it. And once established again, such boundaries become immovable, etched not just into protocol, but into memory. Networks spin pushback. Once the Westminster Abbey moment became impossible to ignore, Camilla's advisors activated the machinery that had served her so well during past storms. Friendly columnists in the Telegraph and the Daily Mail rushed to print flattering portraits of her as a devoted mother and grandmother figure. The BBC highlighted her charity engagements focusing on her literacy work and visits to care homes, filling screens with images of her smiling, approachable Steady. It was the same choreography as always: flood the public with benevolence, drown the controversy in soft-focus stories. But this time the spin was met with unusual resistance. Reporters who had quietly spoken with staff inside the Abbey began to piece together the real story. Reuters published a measured piece, noting visible tension between senior royals. While The Guardian ran a more pointed analysis, Laura's glare at Princess Anne has reignited debate about the Queen Consort's ambitions for her children. Al Jazeera went further, framing it as a failed attempt to expand influence by proxy. And Deutsche Welle stressed that the monarchy's credibility depends on preventing private ambitions from bleeding into public symbolism. The counter-narrative had formed, and no amount of photographs could erase it. Inside the palace, the pushback grew sharper. Courtiers began to question Camilla's access, quietly limiting her input on ceremonial arrangements. Seating charts and guest lists were reviewed with greater scrutiny, ensuring no repeat of Westminster's optics. Invitations to informal gatherings grew more selective, with William and Catherine tightening the circle around their children. Even Charles, loyal as ever to Camilla, appeared unsettled, aware that the credibility of his reign depended on unity, not controversy. The so-called Canada Plan. Camilla's whispered hope of bringing Laura into a semi-official overseas role, presented as cultural outreach, collapsed almost overnight. Once touted as a way to modernize the monarchy's outreach, it now looked reckless. Advisors warned that public acceptance of Camilla had never extended to her children, and any attempt to elevate Laura would invite backlash. The idea was shelved quietly but decisively, leaving Camilla's maternal ambition checked by the very institution she had worked so long to inhabit. Public opinion hardened too. Social media replayed the Abbey footage, endlessly pairing Laura's stare with images of Anne's composure. Hashtags invoking Diana surged once again, reminding the world that Camilla's acceptance was conditional and fragile. Polling by YouGov showed a dip in her favorability, while support for William and Catherine remained strong. The generational divide widened. Younger Britons overwhelmingly sided with Anne, reading the moment as proof that the monarchy must protect itself from private overreach. Camilla, ever resilient, carried on with her duties. Her smile never faltered. Her voice remained warm. Her schedule full. Yet those who knew her best saw the tension in her eyes, the flicker of frustration when Laura was quietly excluded from future plans. Endurance had always been her hallmark. She had survived ridicule, scandal, and decades of suspicion. But this was different. This was not a storm to outlast. This was the institution itself drawing boundaries around her. I realized then that networks, no matter how skilled, cannot always reshape reality. Spin can soothe public opinion, but it cannot erase memory. Once the image of Laura's glare and Anne's resolve had entered the collective imagination, it became part of the monarchy's story. The pushback was not explosive, but it was steady, deliberate, and absolute. By the time spring engagements resumed, Camilla's advisors had scaled back their efforts. The narrative could not be shifted. It could only be managed. Camilla remained queen consort, but her maternal ambition had been checked, her networks exposed as less invincible than they once seemed. The Abbey had redrawn the lines, and no amount of choreography could change that. Reckoning limits. What endures? The reckoning that followed. Westminster was not loud, nor was it dramatic. It unfolded in the subtle way palace shifts always do, through recalibrated access, carefully chosen silences, and new boundaries that quietly defined what Camilla could and could not touch. On the surface, little changed. She remained queen consort, her schedule filled with engagements, her smile polished for cameras. But beneath the surface, the ground had shifted, and the limits of her reach were suddenly clear. Charles stood by her in public, his loyalty unshaken, but even he could not ignore the consequences of Laura's glare at Anne. Behind closed doors, he was forced to accept that any attempt to elevate Camilla's children risked undermining his reign. The so-called Canada plan was buried without ceremony, and courtiers began ensuring that Laura's appearances were firmly private, never public. For a king who understood the fragility of legitimacy, the lesson was unavoidable. Survival of the crown depended on clarity, not blurred lines. Anne, by contrast, emerged stronger. Her stillness during the Abbey moment was read as discipline, her silence as strength. The Guardian called her the immovable axis of duty, while Deutsche Welle described her as a reminder that legitimacy rests on service, not inheritance of ambition. William and Catherine quietly reinforced her stance. Their children, especially Charlotte, were shielded from further pressures, and the idea of Camilla as grandmother to Diana's grandchildren was quietly but firmly dismissed. Camilla endured as she always had. Endurance was her gift, her armor, the trait that had carried her from scandal to coronation. But endurance alone cannot rewrite memory. Public sentiment reflected the paradox. YouGov polling showed that older Britons continued to accept her, even respect her. But younger generations grew colder, their loyalty fixed firmly on William, Catherine, and their children. On social media, Diana's image resurfaced again and again, paired with captions that framed her as the grandmother who lived on through the heirs. International reporting sharpened the contrast. Reuters called Westminster a turning point in the Queen Consort's integration, while Al Jazeera framed it more bluntly. Camilla's family ambitions have collided with the immovable wall of tradition. Even the BBC, often restrained, acknowledged that the Abbey moment had left a mark the monarchy could not ignore. The crown, it seemed, had drawn its boundaries with finality. For Camilla, the reckoning was not a fall from grace, but a narrowing of horizons. She would continue to smile at schoolchildren, continue to speak softly at charity events, continue to stand by Charles at ceremonies. But she would not shape the monarchy's next chapter. Her influence would not extend to William's household, nor to the heirs who carried Diana's legacy. She remained part of the institution, but she was no longer at its center. What endures then is not Camilla's ambition, but the truth revealed by that single glare. Monarchy survives because it protects symbols of fairness, continuity, and service. The attempt to elevate Laura, however subtle, tested that principle and failed. Anne's silence, William's distance, Catherine's grace, and Charlotte's honesty together redrew the lines, ensuring that memory and bloodline prevailed over ambition. I often think back to that moment in Westminster Abbey, the death stare on one side, the calm defiance on the other. It was brief, almost silent, but its echoes still resound. For Camilla, it marked the limits of what endurance could achieve. For the monarchy, it reaffirmed what must always endure: legitimacy born of duty, memory carried through generations, and the quiet strength that even the sharpest glare cannot shake.